Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, and I've got them all here with me, with an oddly kind of sort of similar colour scheme going on. Unintentional of sort of having a white teal colour range, but there we go. Anyway, but I have had quite a fun reading week, and it feels nice, especially as, you know, a couple of weeks ago wasn't feeling great, and I've been kind of getting back on the wagon, as it were. Probably not the right phrase, but I've been getting back into it, and so it's been really fun to kind of read through a few library books that I need to give back, and get on with those. So I'm just going to talk about those here. First up, I read two books by Sara Baume, and I've got a separate video coming up just about Sara Baume herself and her books, because long story short, read Seven Steeples at the end of last year, loved it. It ended up being one of my favourite books of the year, and then sort of made it a sort of personal mission to go back and read her other three. And two of them are ones I've read this week. And I'll just sort of do them very, very quickly, but there's a separate video coming out on just sort of a bit of a love letter to Sara Baume's books. But the first being Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, which is sort of a bit of a play on spring, summer, fall, winter. But essentially is a really beautiful book of this man, Ray, who is 57, who finds a dog that's been left behind, and he and this dog sort of go on a bit of an adventure. And although at the heart of it, that sounds maybe a little bit schmaltzy or a little bit simplistic as a storyline, actually, I think there's something really quite profound about the way this book is done. Not only because there's so much that comes up about loneliness and belonging and family and things like that through the whole process, but also just Sara Baume's observations are just really quite profound and quite astute, I think. So for example, she talks about one point, Ray is trying to shush this dog and is sort of doing this sort of, you know, like a shh kind of thing at it, and the dog, Sara Baume writes something along the lines of, the dog was probably wondering why I was hissing like a tire being deflated. And actually, it was just such a, not only a really fun and interesting line, but also I found something quite interesting in that behind the scenes of sort of, well, actually, yes, to a dog, our random noises make absolutely no sense. And they're probably like, what are you doing? So I really enjoyed this. I think this is just such a beautiful book and a really great introduction to Sara Baume. It's her first book, which she then followed up with A Line Made by Walking. And we see some sort of similar themes in terms of nature cropping up, but particularly we see a character, I think Frankie, I keep on forgetting her name, Frankie, who is essentially in a bit of a rough patch in her life. She's in her 20s. She has various signs that we'd probably call depression, and she walks around finding dead animals, often sort of roadkill or, you know, things like that, and she takes photos of them. And for her, taking photos of them and kind of making it part of some kind of art project is her way of not necessarily healing in quite that sense, but of trying to understand death, of trying to understand darkness, and trying to pick herself back up. And again, all of this makes it sound like this book is thoroughly depressing, but it's not. I found this book really quite beautiful in its own way as well. And I think kind of like with Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither and her other books, I think there's something about the way that Sara Baume writes sort of dark moments in people's lives, but then brings it back to something around art or around meaning and about purpose in life that I find really quite engaging. And her writing is just stunning, in my opinion. Just really great lines and a really well crafted sort of voice for each book. You know, the voice of Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither is this 57-year-old man, and it feels very consistent. There's definitely a Sara Baume-ness to both books, but they definitely carry their narrators' voices really well as well, I think. Next up, I read Difference is Born on the Lips by Michael Handrick. And this is a non-fiction book that I saw sort of floating around towards the end of last year and had been really keen to read based on what people have been saying about it. So essentially, a lot of this book deals with Michael Handrick talking about his younger years, especially, and him finding his identity not only as a gay man, but also as someone who's working class, and navigating the fact that, you know, he's often seen as quite effeminate and all of these sorts of things all combined. And so he often has these sort of things pulling at him from all sides, right? That, you know, he wants to be involved in the arts, and then people tell him that that's not a particularly masculine thing to do, and it's a gay thing to do, but also working class boys like you don't do this, and all of these sorts of complicated things. And I think what also then separates this from just being a fairly regular standalone memoir is the way that he then brings in a wider conversation around the state of LGBTQ plus rights in the UK and elsewhere. So he talks, for example, about Section 28 and the impact that would have had on meaning that things couldn't be discussed in schools. For those of you sort of outside of the UK or who haven't heard about it before, Section 28 was a law that meant that you couldn't promote homosexuality in schools, and that term was used very loosely of what promotion might mean, and it led to, for example, teachers just absolutely never mentioning anything to do with people being gay, even where it was a big part of a story, right? You know, talking about a war poet like, you know, Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, and not even really being able to mention that there was this sort of additional, you know, sort of rumoured / seen in diaries thing about them. And, you know, even sort of throwaway comments or additional little bits of context couldn't be added because that might be seen as, you know, pushing against this law, and that could be quite dangerous for teachers. It was in place for most of my time at school as well. So this book, I think, is a really interesting and very warm-hearted way of looking at some really quite dark things. Michael Handrick really delves into some of the darkest parts of his life and really finds a sense of community and purpose and what have you in here. We've got passages where he talks about shame and how that sometimes means that he would put himself in danger because he kind of felt that that's all he was sort of worth or what have you. It's a really beautiful and interesting book, a very easily readable one, despite the difficult themes, I think, as well. Next up, in what feels like almost the polar opposite of Michael Handrick's book, Johnny, Would You Love Me If My Dick Were Bigger by Brontez Purnell. Great title. So I read Brontez Purnell's other two books, at least the ones that have been released in the UK. And I'm a little torn. I really enjoyed the books overall, but there is something profoundly quite depressing about them for me, despite kind of some of the subject matter, right? So anyway, the whole idea. So Brontez Purnell is this man, was part of a punk band. He sort of is a writer. He writes really quite candidly and frankly about sex, about relationships, about whatever else. But the sex in his books is pretty much, it's almost always sort of not particularly fulfilling, let's say, for him. You know, it's very much these things happen. These are very one-off encounters a lot of the time. He seems like, you know, he talks a bit more, I think, in this book than perhaps the other two, about how it sort of become a genuine addiction. And I think that's the thing that feels quite unsettling in this book and in the other two as well, is he writes so frankly and candidly and unapologetically about sex, about the amount of sex he's having, about what kind of sex he's having, about what it looks like, all those sorts of things. But ultimately, we know that this is part of an addiction, and he often doesn't seem massively in control of some aspects of this. And so this book kind of leaves me with a bit of a quandary, because lots of this book is incredibly funny, is incredibly like open in a really refreshing way. There's something quite liberating about the way he writes and he speaks in some ways. However, at the heart of it, you also do feel a bit concerned for him, because, for example, at one point he's going to various groups for sex addiction or for various other addictions, and he he sort of seems really quite trapped in a way, but the writing is still so full of energy and life and is funny and what have you. So I feel quite torn because on one hand, I'm really quite glad that he escapes the pressure to have to write in a certain way, of having to say, I did all this and now I'm deeply ashamed and now I've changed my life and blah, blah, blah. He avoids that kind of typical memoir structure, and sort of the typical way that a lot of people are forced to tell stories about dark periods in their life, where they feel like they have to put it all out there, say how bad they feel about it, and then have this happy ending at the end of the book. And so there is something really quite refreshing about the fact that he avoids it. I do find that there's something quite unsettling still as a reader about kind of being like, but are you actually okay? Like, I'm not sure how good you maybe feel about all of this. And, you know, there's sort of that difficult line of gallows humor, right? Of, in the darkest moment, the sort of gutter humor of, I feel awful, but let me make a joke about my terrible circumstances. And that can be incredibly funny. That can bring people together. But then when the book is 150 pages of laughing at being at your lowest moments, I don't know how funny the joke sometimes feels. But at the same time, there are some incredibly funny bits in this book. I'm really torn. Overall, I think I really enjoy it. I think it's still really worth picking up if it seems like your kind of thing, and if you're not particularly grossed out by long passages of just writing about sex. But I would add a caveat that it's a little unsettling in its own way as well. So I kind of mixed feelings all around about that. I also realised with that last book, I was literally just waving around a book that just says dick in giant letters. So there we go. Probably going to get demonetized for that. Joys of joys. And last but not least, I read Sanatorium by Abi Palmer. So I'm reading over a couple of old books from former Barbellion Prize shortlist, partly just because they sound really interesting to me, and partly also just because I'm one book away from finishing reading this year's Barbellion Prize shortlist and long list. But that book has not yet arrived, despite me having ordered it about 2 months ago. So I sort of decided to go and read some other ones. So Abi Palmer's Sanatorium is a really interesting book. And I, for the sort of 200 pages, they are often pages with not a great amount of text and with some diagrams and pictures and everything. Sanatorium is based on the idea that Abi Palmer, it's a non-fiction book, is writing about her experiences of chronic ill health and illness, and she is watching as her body slowly becomes a bit sorer, or at times just things don't work in the way that she's expecting. And so she goes to a spa, a sort of bathhouse spa treatment center thing in Hungary, and she basically documents her experience of being there. And what I think follows through this is a really fun and engaging book, despite being about a really tricky topic, because there's a candidness and a humor to this book that I find really engaging and really wise in many ways, despite the fact that she's talking about some really dark moments. So she's talking about how her legs will sort of suddenly hurt a lot or won't really work, or how she'll have this giant pain in her back, or what have you. And she's sort of writing about this experience of floating in this sort of special sort of sulphurous water that's meant to be really good for you. And at times she's like, well, this smells awful and I hate it. At times she is just sort of enjoying the process of her body just floating and seemingly floating away from her. But then at times that freaks her out, because she thinks, well, am I sort of cutting this imaginary cord and my body's going to go floating off? And, you know, all of these things. So she goes through all of this in a really beautiful and interesting way. And I really loved actually the very sort of short staccato way that it's done, with sort of these tiny passages. Because sometimes one anecdote will stretch over several pages because she'll almost highlight a specific moment. So something will happen and she'll say, you know, the next page will be one sentence of, and then this man said this thing that's actually quite troubling. And there's something about the way that she structured this book that really highlights key passages for you in a way that's really quite unsettling. but also very beautiful. I realise I'm saying unsettling a lot. This has been a very unsettling week reading wise. But I think, yeah, this is just such a beautiful, beautiful book. And I think there's something so clever about the way this is done. It's a very short read. I pretty much just swallowed it up in one gulp. And I kind of left feeling really quite moved by the way that this book approaches things. But also she's kind of in with you. It's not kind of a pity party kind of style of book. She very much wants to let you know how difficult this thing has been, but also find some kind of wisdom or humor or what have you in the midst of it all as well. And those have been the books that I've read this week. As mentioned, an unsettling bunch of books, but really quite beautiful in many, many ways as well. I'm slowly going to be shifting a bit into prize mode very soon, but still very much trying to read lots of books that I took out from the library. I make this mistake every year. I get to sort of December, or like November, December, I see loads of end of year lists of books. I think, wow, like these books all sound fascinating. Let me just quickly reserve them all from the library, or kind of a book I've really enjoyed from the year. And then I'll be like, great, I'm going to reserve all of them. And then I think in my mind, January and February are perfect times to read all of this because prizes, like a few of the big prizes haven't kicked in yet. And then forget that like January and February is when lots of prizes kick into action. And I'm suddenly like, okay. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing soon. But really, really interesting to read these nonetheless. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a good week. And I shall speak to you all soon. Have a fantastic one. Take care. Speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.